Last time we looked at the limitless obedience of Jesus to his Father. Laying aside his rights and majesty, Jesus put us first and humbled himself, even though it led to death on a cross. Now, Paul uses Jesus' humble obedience as a model for his own people, those united to him, something he makes explicit through the use of the word obey in verse 12. Paul is saying, use Jesus' commitment, putting others first, as a model for your own obedience. Paul's already hinted at what that might look like in the Philippians case, willingly suffering for the gospel's advance and uniting and serving one another to ensure that everyone perseveres with joy. For Paul, obeying like this matters, and so asks for obedience from the Philippians, whether he's able to rejoin them personally or not, as he signals in verse 12. The possibility of Paul never revisiting Philippi probably provoked different reactions. Perhaps, as we saw in chapter 1, some were glad to have Paul off the scene. But for most, Paul's continuing absence would have been a sad and destabilizing reality. Some were probably asking, how will we manage without Paul's teaching, encouragement, and prayers for us? Perhaps those who have recently moved to university can empathise. Without the continued presence of significant people alongside us, we sense a big hole in our spiritual input. Imagine then how reassured the Philippians must have felt by Paul's reminder in verse 13, that the living God was amongst them all, working out and fulfilling his good purpose for them. Whilst we may be separated from parents, friends, church leaders, the God who ministered through them to us is still at work in us. God himself is committed to moulding us into Jesus' likeness as we live and speak for him. And our response to God's ongoing work in us, says Paul, should be twofold. We should fearfully tremble, not that we're scared of God, but that we are in awe that he stooped to work in us through his Spirit and by his word. And we should actively cooperate with God, keenly working out the full effects of what Jesus has won for us throughout our lives. Paul applies these principles to a specific area in verse 14, to grumbling and arguing. It's probably not so much the grumbling and arguing amongst the Philippians that Paul has in mind there, though that was certainly going on. Instead, it's probably the grumbling and arguing with God that Paul's particularly thinking of. The Philippians' hearts have become sour towards God, and it shows, even if outwardly they may be doing many of the right things. In other words, the Philippian church has lost their joy in their obedience. And to Paul, this matters. God doesn't call those united with Jesus only to outward obedience. He wants our hearts engaged too. So, Paul continues. In verse 15, he quotes Deuteronomy 32, taking the Philippians back to the time when Israel wandered in the wilderness. During this period, freed from Egypt and not yet in the promised land, a repeated theme was the people's frequent grumblings against God. Paul's point is that whatever the state of their outward obedience, the people's ongoing complaints made it obvious to those watching on that they often doubted God. Even the Israelites frequently found fault with their God. Why should anyone else trust him? In the same way, Paul is saying to the Philippians, when you obey God only bad-temperedly, you communicate to those around you that God isn't really good, that he can't satisfy you, or that he doesn't care enough to deal kindly in the areas most important to you. On the other hand, says Paul, when we follow Jesus with joy, even when life is hard, we demonstrate the purity of our faith. We mark ourselves out as different. We shine like stars in a dark sky. To be clear, Paul isn't saying Jesus people must plaster fake smiles on their faces, nor is he saying we can't find things hard. As we'll see in chapter 4 of Philippians, God longs for us to pour our hearts out to him in prayer, coming just as we are. Sometimes these prayers will be very raw, but there's a key distinction between grumbling with God and honest prayer. Authentic Christianity isn't devoid of pain, but as things hurt, we remind ourselves that we know enough about what he is like and what he has done that we're able to entrust even our pains to him. It is in this attitude that we shine. Indeed, Paul models this attitude himself. In verse 17, he recognizes that he may be about to be poured out as a drink offering. Pouring a drink offering was the very last thing a priest did when making a temple sacrifice. In other words, Paul recognizes that he may be in his final days. He may soon be put to death as a traitor to the Roman regime. Yet, even in such dark circumstances, Paul says he's able to be glad and rejoice. How? The key, says Paul, is to hold firmly to the word of life. That is, the gospel of Christ. We've already seen the difference that the gospel makes to Paul in prison, to the point that he could confidently state that for him to live is Christ and to die is gain. Now, Paul is still clinging to the life and promises tied up in Jesus, in the word of life, even as he faces his own death. And if we will let it, that same life-changing word can meet us today in our own seasons of pressure and suffering. We too can be freed from the dead ends of grumbling and argument, ushering in instead into the path of joy. And as we walk that path with Jesus alongside, we shine like stars so that all around us can see.